A small piece of broken glass, the burning sun overhead. A massive enemy train carrying weapons and fuel. This sounds impossible, but in 1943, a 12-year-old child used only these two things to strike fear into the heart of the Nazi war machine. No bombs. No guns. Just physics. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. A small boy sits hidden behind frozen rocks in Poland, 1943. His hands shake from cold and fear. In his fingers, he holds something that looks completely harmless, a broken piece of glass from his grandmother's old reading glasses. Below him, a massive Nazi train rolls slowly along the tracks. It carries fuel, weapons, and supplies for German soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front. The boy waits. He angles the glass toward the winter sun. And then something impossible happens. The train explodes. No bombs. No guns. No adult soldiers. Just a 12-year-old child, a piece of glass, and simple physics that the mighty German army never expected. This is not a movie. This is not made up. This is the true story of Joseph, one of the youngest resistance fighters in World War II. By the end of this story, you will understand how a boy with nothing became one of the most dangerous enemies the Nazis never caught. To understand this story, we need to see the world through Joseph's eyes. Poland in 1941 was a nation crushed under Nazi boots. The German army had invaded in 1939 and defeated Poland in just 36 days. By the time our story begins, the country had become a giant prison. The Nazis didn't just occupy Poland. They tried to erase it. They renamed cities. They banned the Polish language in schools. Families disappeared in the middle of the night, taken away by secret police. Young men were forced to work in German factories. Food was rationed so tightly that people starved. And everywhere, always, there were the trains. Nazi trains rolled through Poland day and night. They carried ammunition to soldiers. They carried fuel to tanks. They carried food to German troops while Polish children went hungry. These trains were the veins of the Nazi war machine, pumping life into an empire built on death. In a small farming village far from the big cities, a boy named Joseph lived with his grandmother. His parents had been taken away 2 years earlier by SS officers. He never saw them again. Joseph was small for his age, thin from not having enough food, with dark eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. His grandmother was a tough woman in her 70s. She was all Joseph had left in the world. She taught him to read using her old prayer book and her reading glasses, thick lenses that made the tiny words bigger and easier to see. Life was about survival. You survived by staying invisible, by keeping your head down, by never attracting attention from the Nazi soldiers who patrolled the streets. But Joseph had a problem. He couldn't stay invisible. He couldn't stop thinking. Every day, he watched the Nazi trains pass through the valley below their cottage. He counted them. He memorized when they came. And inside, he burned with anger that no 12-year-old should have to carry. Joseph knew the trains were important. Somewhere on those trains were supplies that kept the concentration camps running. Ammunition that killed resistance fighters. Fuel that powered tanks crushing villages in Russia. He wanted to fight back. But how? He was just a child. The tracks were heavily guarded. Patrols swept the countryside constantly. People caught doing sabotage were hanged in public squares as warnings to others. The Polish resistance, the Armia Krajowa, operated in secret, and they didn't recruit children. Joseph was completely alone. But being alone didn't mean being powerless. It just meant he had to think differently. Every night, Joseph lay awake in his small bed, listening to the distant whistle of trains cutting through the darkness. Each sound was a reminder of the enemy that controlled everything. His grandmother would sometimes wake to find him sitting by the window, staring out at the valley where the railway tracks gleamed in the moonlight. "You cannot fight them with hate alone," she would whisper, though she never told him not to fight. She understood that some fires burned too hot to be extinguished by fear. The village itself was dying slowly. Children no longer played in the streets. Laughter had become a forgotten sound. The church bells that once marked the hours now hung silent. The Nazis had banned their ringing. Food grew scarcer each week. The bread ration was cut again and again until families were surviving on portions that would barely feed a bird. Joseph saw elderly neighbors grow weak and die from hunger. He saw young girls taken away to work in German factories, never to return. He saw the light fade from people's eyes as hope became a luxury they could no longer afford. This wasn't just occupation. This was systematic destruction of a people's soul. One hot afternoon in late summer 1942, Joseph sat on a hillside watching the trains pass. The sun beat down so hard that the metal tracks shimmered with heat waves. He had brought his grandmother's reading glasses to pass the time, using the thick lenses to focus sunlight into tiny bright points. It was just a game. He could burn small holes in dry leaves by concentrating the sunlight through the glass. But as he watched a long supply train crawl around the bend below, something clicked in his mind. Fire. The trains carried fuel. Those tanker cars were painted with warning symbols. And glass, when held at the right angle, could focus sunlight into a beam hot enough to set almost anything on fire. The idea was crazy. It was impossible. But it was also brilliant. Joseph remembered something his teacher had taught him before the schools were closed, how ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes supposedly used mirrors to focus sunlight and burn Roman ships. The Nazis had banned that story, calling it Allied propaganda. But what if it was true? What if light itself could become a weapon? His hands trembled as he held the lens. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a boy who had paid attention in school and now saw possibility where others saw only powerlessness. The physics were simple enough. The curved glass lens bent light rays inward, concentrating them to a single burning point. The stronger the sun, the hotter that point became. Hot enough to ignite paper. Hot enough to char wood. Hot enough, perhaps, to ignite fuel vapor leaking from a Nazi tanker car. Joseph pocketed the glasses and ran home, his heart pounding. He had a plan that would either make him a hero or get him killed. Maybe both. For weeks, Joseph studied and experimented in secret. He tested angles. He measured distances. He learned about timing. He discovered that the lens needed to be held at exactly the right position to create a focal point, a tiny spot of concentrated light small enough and hot enough to ignite fuel vapors. He learned that he had only a few seconds when trains slowed down on uphill curves. He learned that if he failed, if he was spotted, his grandmother would be killed alongside him. But Joseph also learned something else. The Nazis, for all their power and cruelty, had a weakness. They never imagined that a child with a piece of glass could be a threat. That invisibility would become his greatest weapon. The first attempt came on a cold morning in October 1942. Joseph chose his position carefully, a rocky spot hidden by thick bushes that overlooked the steepest section of track, where trains slowed to a crawl climbing the hill. He arrived before dawn. His grandmother thought he was looking for mushrooms in the forest, a lie that made his stomach hurt with guilt. But this was bigger than one boy or one family. This was about making the Nazis pay. He waited for 3 hours, shivering in the frost, until he heard the distant rumble of an approaching train. His hands shook as he unwrapped the lens. This was it. The moment that would prove if his theory worked or expose him as a foolish child playing with death. The train came into view slowly, a massive metal snake of cars marked with German military symbols. Joseph counted the cars as they passed, troop transport, ammunition, medical supplies. And then, midway through, he saw it. A fuel tanker. The yellow diamond warning symbol was clearly visible even from his hiding spot. The train began climbing the hill, wheels screeching as it slowed to barely faster than walking speed. Joseph positioned himself. He angled the lens toward the sun, which had finally broken through the morning clouds. A bright point of light appeared on the ground in front of him. He adjusted the angle. The point of light sharpened, became more focused. His heart hammered so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. Then he aimed the concentrated beam at the seam where the tanker's fuel cap met the metal body, a spot he had identified during his weeks of watching as the most likely place for fuel vapor to escape. Nothing happened. 10 seconds passed. 20. The train continued its slow climb. Joseph's arm began to ache from holding the lens perfectly still. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cold. Had he been wrong? Was this entire plan just the fantasy of a desperate child? And then, just as the tanker began to move out of range, he saw it. A thin wisp of smoke, then a flicker of orange flame. Then a small fire that seemed to dance along the metal seam. For one frozen moment, Joseph thought it would simply burn out. But fuel vapor doesn't forgive. When it ignites, it doesn't ask permission. The explosion tore through the morning silence like thunder from an angry god. The tanker car erupted in a massive fireball that lifted the entire vehicle off its wheels and slammed it sideways into the car behind it. Secondary explosions followed as fire spread. Black smoke poured into the sky. The train lurched to a halt, brakes screaming. Joseph didn't wait to see more. He grabbed the lens, shoved it into his coat, and ran. His legs pumped through the forest, branches tearing at his face and clothes. Behind him, he could hear shouting in German, sharp commands of officers organizing a search. His lungs burned. His vision blurred. But he didn't stop running until he burst through the door of his grandmother's cottage, chest heaving, face white with terror and joy. His grandmother looked up from her sewing. She saw the soot on his hands, the wild look in his eyes, the way he clutched her reading glasses like they were made of gold. She said nothing. She simply stood, walked to the window, and looked toward the column of black smoke rising in the distance. Then she turned back to her grandson, placed one wrinkled hand on his shoulder, and squeezed once. It was the only acknowledgement he would ever receive. It was enough. Joseph had struck his first blow against the Third Reich. And he was just getting started. The Nazi response was swift and brutal. Within hours of the explosion, SS units swept through the surrounding villages like a plague. They went house to house, questioning families, searching barns and cellars, looking for any sign of resistance activity. 3 men from a neighboring village were arrested on suspicion of sabotage and hanged from lampposts in the town square as a warning. Their bodies were left there for 5 days, swaying in the wind, a horrible reminder of what happened to those who defied the Reich. The executions were public spectacles designed to break the spirit of resistance. Women were forced to watch. Children were made to stand in silence. Anyone who looked away was beaten. The message was clear: this is what happens when you fight back. Joseph watched from the crowd, his face carefully blank, his eyes downcast like every other terrified villager. Inside, his stomach churned with guilt and rage. These men had done nothing. They didn't even know about the attack. They died simply because the Nazis needed someone to punish, someone to make an example of. One of the hanged men was a farmer named Pavel who had once given Joseph a ride home in his cart during a rainstorm. Another was a blacksmith who had fixed his grandmother's cooking pot for free because he knew they had no money. The third was so young, barely 20 years old, with a wife and baby daughter. The Germans assumed this was the work of the Polish resistance. They responded with the only language they knew, overwhelming force and punishment. But they were hunting ghosts. They questioned adults. They tortured suspected partisans. They increased patrols along the railway. Not once did they consider that the saboteur might be a skinny 12-year-old boy with a piece of glass. Joseph watched the hangings from a distance, hidden among the crowd of terrified villagers forced to witness the executions. He felt the weight of those deaths like stones in his stomach. 3 innocent men died because of what he had done. But he also understood something crucial in that moment. The Nazis were afraid. That explosion had disrupted their supply line, caused chaos, and forced them to divert resources to security. One boy with one lens had made the mighty Third Reich flinch. And if he could do it once, he could do it again. For the next 6 months, Joseph became a phantom on the hillsides. He developed a system, a careful method born from desperation and genius combined. He never struck from the same position twice. He studied patrol schedules and learned when guards changed shifts, when their attention was weakest. He memorized train timetables, noting which convoys carried the most valuable cargo. He became an expert in the physics of focused sunlight. He understood how weather conditions, time of day, and angle affected the intensity of the beam. On cloudy days, he didn't even try. On clear days with strong sun, he could ignite fuel vapors in under 30 seconds. He learned to read the trains themselves, identifying which tanker cars were full by how they sat on the tracks, which ammunition cars were most dangerous, which supply trains were headed east to fight the Russians. His grandmother never asked questions. But she began leaving him extra food wrapped in cloth. And she stopped wondering aloud where her reading glasses had gone. By spring 1943, Joseph had successfully attacked 7 trains. Not all attempts resulted in massive explosions like the first one. Sometimes he only managed to start small fires that forced trains to stop for emergency checks, causing delays that disrupted the German supply chain. But twice more he scored direct hits on fuel tankers that resulted in explosions visible for kilometers. Each success made him bolder. Each success also increased the danger. The Germans knew someone was targeting their supply lines in this specific region. They tripled patrols. They installed machine gun positions overlooking key sections of track. They began running fake trains to draw out saboteurs. The area became one of the most heavily guarded railway sections in occupied Poland. And still the attacks continued. Still trains burned. The Germans began to whisper among themselves about ghosts, about cursed sections of track, about divine punishment. They never suspected the truth because the truth was too ridiculous to consider. The attack that would change everything came in May 1943. Joseph had positioned himself near a railway bridge, a new location he had scouted carefully. The train approaching was different from the others. It was heavily guarded, with armed soldiers visible on flatbed cars at the front and rear. The tanker cars in the middle were marked with special symbols he had never seen before. Later he would learn this was a high-priority fuel shipment for a major German offensive on the Eastern Front. But in that moment, all he knew was that this train mattered. He waited until the train began crossing the bridge, a moment when the guard's attention was focused on watching for explosives on the structure itself. That's when he made his move. He angled the lens, found his focal point, and held steady as the concentrated beam of sunlight found its target on the lead tanker car. What happened next changed everything. The explosion was unlike anything Joseph had ever created. The lead tanker didn't just catch fire, it detonated with such force that the shockwave knocked him backward into the dirt, even from his distant position. The fireball rose 30 meters into the air, a churning column of orange and black that seemed to tear a hole in the sky itself. But this time, the fire didn't stop with one car. The tankers were positioned too close together. The heat from the first explosion ignited the second, then the third, creating a chain reaction that turned the entire middle section of the train into an inferno. The bridge itself began to groan under the stress, metal warping from the intense heat. Joseph watched in frozen horror as the structure buckled, then collapsed, sending burning wreckage plummeting into the ravine below. He had not just destroyed a train. He had destroyed critical Nazi infrastructure. And the Reich would not forgive this. Within 24 hours, the entire region was locked down under martial law. Every village within 20 kilometers was placed under immediate curfew. German troops conducted door-to-door searches with brutal thoroughness. They questioned everyone from elderly farmers to children barely old enough to walk. They brought in Gestapo interrogators from Warsaw, men whose reputation for torture was legendary. They offered massive rewards for information. They made it clear that the entire population would suffer until the saboteur was found. Public executions became daily events. Hostages were taken from each village. The pressure was unbearable, designed to turn neighbor against neighbor. And through it all, Joseph had to remain perfectly calm, perfectly normal, perfectly invisible. The hardest part wasn't the fear of being caught. It was the guilt. Every morning he woke to news of more arrests, more executions, more families torn apart because of what he had done. He saw the faces of the condemned, ordinary people who had nothing to do with resistance but were being murdered as collective punishment. One of them was the village baker, a kind man who had sometimes slipped Joseph extra bread when he thought no one was looking. Another was a young mother with 3 children under age 6. They died because Joseph had been too successful, because his attack had hurt the Germans badly enough that they responded with murderous fury. He stopped eating. He barely slept. His grandmother watched him waste away. And one night, she finally spoke. She told him about his grandfather, who had fought in the Great War and came home broken by what he had seen. She told him that war forces impossible choices on good people. That every act of resistance carries a cost, and that the blood of innocents stains the hands of tyrants, not those who fight them. Her words didn't erase the guilt. But they gave him permission to carry it without being crushed. For 3 weeks, Joseph did nothing. He couldn't risk another attack while the German presence was so overwhelming. But he also watched. He observed how the Germans operated, how they thought, how they responded to threats. He noticed that their security measures were reactive rather than proactive. They fortified areas after attacks but left other sections vulnerable. They focused on adult men and known resistance members but ignored children and elderly women. And slowly, carefully, Joseph began to plan his next move. Because stopping now would mean those deaths were for nothing. Stopping now would mean the Nazis had won. By summer, Joseph had evolved his tactics. He scouted positions farther from the tracks than ever before, places where he could operate with greater safety but would need perfect conditions and flawless execution to succeed. He was no longer just a guerrilla fighter. He was becoming something more sophisticated. He was becoming a sniper, except his weapon was the sun, and his ammunition was infinite. The attack that would cement his legacy came on a scorching afternoon in late July 1943. He had identified a position nearly 400 meters from the tracks, an unprecedented distance that would have been impossible with conventional sabotage. The Germans had cleared vegetation near the tracks but hadn't extended their efforts this far up the hillside, assuming such distance made the position useless. They were correct for every weapon except the one Joseph wielded. The train he targeted was the most heavily guarded convoy he had ever attempted. It carried high-grade aviation fuel for Luftwaffe bases supporting operations on the Eastern Front. Armed guards were positioned on every third car. A spotter plane flew reconnaissance overhead. Motorcycle patrols swept the area 2 hours before the train's scheduled passage. But all their security measures assumed a threat from ground level, from close range, from the shadows. They never looked up toward the distant hilltop where a skinny 13-year-old boy lay perfectly still among the rocks. At 400 meters, the margin for error was non-existent. The slightest tremor in his hand would scatter the focal point across meters of empty air. Even his own breathing could disrupt the precise angle required for ignition. So Joseph did what he had trained himself to do. He became still, not just physically motionless, but mentally calm, entering a state of focus so complete that the world narrowed to 3 elements: the sun, the lens, and the target. He held the beam on the fuel cap of the third tanker car for 30 seconds. 45. His entire body screamed with the effort of remaining perfectly still. 1 minute. And then, impossibly far away, he saw the first wisp of smoke rise from the metal. The explosion that followed tore the tanker apart from the inside out. But because the train was moving at speed rather than crawling uphill, the destroyed tanker derailed at high velocity, slamming into the car ahead while the car behind crashed into it from behind. The entire middle section of the train collapsed into itself. Then the other fuel tankers, ruptured by impact, added their contributions to the inferno. Within seconds, a train moving at full speed became a stationary wall of flame stretching across 200 meters of track. Joseph watched the smoke rise, then carefully wrapped his lens and began the long walk home. He had just changed the course of battles he would never see, saved lives he would never know, and proved that even the smallest resistance could strike at the heart of tyranny. By November 1943, winter arrived in Poland. The countryside transformed into a landscape of gray skies and persistent clouds that rendered Joseph's weapon useless. Days passed without sufficient sunlight to create the focused beam necessary for ignition. He attempted 2 strikes during this period. Both failed, the weak winter sun unable to generate enough heat at the distances he needed for safety. He was not defeated by German intelligence or superior tactics. He was defeated by weather and the rotation of the earth. But the timing may have saved his life. By November, the Gestapo investigation had narrowed its focus and was conducting surveillance that would have eventually identified patterns in his movements. The lead investigator had begun developing a theory that the saboteur might be operating from elevated positions at extreme range. Given another month, he might have solved the puzzle. But the attack stopped before his investigation could reach its conclusion. Without new incidents to analyze, his superiors lost interest and reassigned him to more pressing concerns on the Eastern Front. The mystery of the phantom saboteur remained unsolved, relegated to a footnote in regional occupation reports and eventually forgotten. Joseph survived the winter and lived to see the Soviet liberation of Poland in 1944. His grandmother died in March of that year. Her heart simply gave out after years of accumulated stress and fear. Joseph was 14 years old and completely alone. The lens, his weapon and companion through months of solitary warfare, was buried with her, wrapped in cloth and placed in her folded hands. He never told anyone what he had done. Not the Soviet liberators. Not the reformed Polish government. Not the historians who later documented resistance activities. The idea of explaining his campaign seemed absurd in the aftermath of industrial genocide and total war. What was one boy with a lens compared to the millions who had fought and died? How could he claim credit for strikes that had killed German soldiers and Polish civilians alike? The moral weight of his actions had no clear resolution, no satisfying narrative of heroism untouched by doubt. He carried the secret silently through the rest of his life, through the communist era in Poland, through immigration to America in the early 1950s, through marriage and children and a career as a machinist in Detroit. He became one of millions of displaced persons rebuilding lives in the shadow of trauma they could not discuss. Only once, in 1987, did Joseph tell his story. He was 60 years old, dying of lung cancer in a veterans hospital, when a young Polish-American graduate student conducting oral histories of World War II resistance fighters interviewed him. The student, expecting conventional stories of armed partisans and underground networks, listened with growing disbelief as Joseph described focusing sunlight through his grandmother's reading lens to destroy Nazi trains. The interview was recorded on cassette tape, transcribed, and filed in a university archive where it remained unread for decades. No historian took it seriously. The story seemed too fantastic, too much like a tall tale told by an old man mixing memories with imagination. There was no corroborating evidence, no German records acknowledging such attacks, no other witnesses. Joseph's campaign disappeared into the vast grave of unverified wartime stories, neither proven nor disproven, just forgotten. The truth remained buried until 2018, when a German military historian named Dr. Helena Zimmermann was researching railway sabotage in occupied Poland. While examining previously classified Wehrmacht logistics reports in the German Federal Archives, she discovered a series of incident reports from summer and fall 1943 describing unexplained fires on fuel transport trains in a specific region of occupied Poland. What caught her attention wasn't just the frequency of incidents, but the investigative notes attached. German engineers had examined the wreckage and found no evidence of explosives, no timing devices, no chemical accelerants, nothing that matched known sabotage techniques. Several reports specifically noted that attacks occurred only on clear, sunny days and seemed to originate from elevated positions at extreme distances. One investigator had even theorized about concentrated solar energy as a weapon, though he dismissed his own hypothesis as physically improbable. Dr. Zimmermann cross-referenced these reports with Allied intelligence and Polish resistance archives and found nothing. No partisan group ever claimed responsibility. No Allied operation matched the timeline. Then, while conducting background research, she discovered the interview transcript in the Wayne State University archives. She recognized immediately that the details matched the German reports with uncanny precision. The dates aligned. The locations matched. The methodology explained the forensic mysteries that had baffled Wehrmacht investigators. She spent 2 years verifying every checkable element of Joseph's account. Everything that could be verified was accurate. In 2020, Dr. Zimmermann published her findings in a peer-reviewed academic journal, presenting the case that a 13-year-old boy using a reading lens had conducted one of the most unusual sabotage campaigns in military history. The story received little mainstream attention. It was too strange, too unlikely, too removed from conventional narratives of World War II heroism. But the story matters precisely because it is strange and unlikely. Joseph's campaign demonstrates a truth that empires throughout history have tried to suppress. Resistance does not require armies or advanced weapons or elaborate planning. It requires only determination, creativity, and the willingness to act when action seems impossible. A 12-year-old boy with no training, no support, and no resources beyond a broken lens proved that individual resistance could disrupt the machinery of industrial warfare. He forced one of the most powerful militaries in human history to divert substantial resources to hunting a threat they could not understand or stop. He saved lives by destroying supplies that would have fueled tanks and aircraft used to kill Allied soldiers and Soviet civilians. The cost of his campaign was terrible, paid in Polish blood through Nazi reprisals. That moral complexity deserves recognition rather than simplification. Resistance is never clean. Heroism is never uncomplicated. But neither is submission to tyranny. The lens that Joseph used was buried with his grandmother in an unmarked grave somewhere in rural Poland, its location lost to time. His own grave is in a small cemetery outside Detroit, marked with a simple headstone that lists his name, dates, and the single word, machinist. There is no mention of trains destroyed or Nazi supply lines disrupted or a child's war fought in solitary silence. The historical record has no monuments to his campaign, no plaques marking the hillsides where he positioned himself, no textbooks teaching students about the physics of focused sunlight used as a weapon of resistance. His story survives only in a handful of academic papers and now, finally, here. It survives because truth, no matter how strange or uncomfortable, has a way of emerging from the shadows if you look carefully enough. And the truth is this. Courage is not the absence of fear or the presence of strength. Courage is a 13-year-old boy deciding that submission to evil is worse than the risk of death, and then proving through action that even the smallest light, properly focused, can burn down the darkness. That is the story they never told you. That is the history that was almost lost. And that is why, 80 years later, we remember the name Joseph, and the weapon that was nothing more than his grandmother's broken glasses and the power of the sun.